Title: The Quiet Season Chapter 1. The wind off the water. Harold first saw Martin Chase on a Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that felt borrowed from October even though it was mid-June. Gray sky, the smell of salt and pine, wind combing through the grass. Harold had already walked the dog, fed the neighbor's cat, and was halfway through his second cup of coffee when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. From the window over his sink, Harold watched a dusty Volvo wagon back into the driveway of the old lighthouse keeper's cottage. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing jeans and a Red Sox cap. He opened the trunk and pulled out a box of books, talking to himself as he went. "That's the lighthouse guy," Tomas had told him last week over coffee, with the cautious tone reserved for new arrivals. Martin Chase, divorced, English, teacher, Boston escapee. Looks like he's staying the summer. Maybe longer. Harold assumed longer. The cottage hadn't seen a tenant in nearly 4 years, and it looked it. Shingles faded to silver. A porch sagging at one end. But Martin moved through the place like someone who saw what it could become. Harold sipped his coffee, the heat gone from it, and watched Martin carry in box after box, punctuating each trip with a pause to look out at the sea. It was an old habit of Harold's, that watching. He would have called it architectural curiosity once, a professional's interest in people and how they inhabited space. But that wasn't true. Not anymore. Not really. By noon, Martin had unpacked enough to pull a folding chair onto the front porch. He sat with a book in one hand and a glass of something in the other. Wine, Harold guessed. Red. Even in daylight, that he had style. Harold told himself he had no interest. He told himself many things. But the next morning, when he walked past the cottage with his dog, and Martin looked up and smiled and said, "Morning," Harold's heart did something it hadn't done in years. It lurched. Chapter 2. Windbreaks. Martin had been in the cottage for just over a week before Harold found a reason to visit. The pretense was a lighthouse restoration brochure Harold had tucked away from his days volunteering with the Historical Society. He slid it into a folder, dressed in a sweater 2 shades too formal for an August afternoon, and walked the 50 yards of gravel road separating their houses. Martin was on the porch again, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, legs crossed, paperback on his knee. "Afternoon," Harold said, a touch too brisk. Martin looked up and grinned. "Well, look who's finally wandered over. Come sit. You like wine?" Harold hesitated. "I brought this for you," he said, offering the folder instead of answering. Martin took it, opened it, flipped through the pages slowly. "Lighthouse history? That's thoughtful. You're full of surprises." Harold felt himself color. "I used to help with the tours. You ever go up there now?" "Not since Claire." Martin didn't ask who Claire was, and Harold appreciated that. He sat. The porch groaned under his weight. Martin poured 2 glasses of wine without asking. They talked for an hour, about books, and weather, and the stubbornness of old buildings. Harold found himself laughing once or twice, startled by the sound of it in his own throat. As he got up to leave, Martin reached out and touched his arm. "Just briefly. Thanks for coming by. I've been hoping you would." Harold nodded, then walked home slower than he needed to. That night, he didn't sleep well. The old feelings, ones he'd buried so deep they'd nearly fossilized, began to shift. Not in ways he fully understood. Not yet. But enough to keep him staring at the ceiling until dawn. Chapter 3. Blue hydrangeas. The first time Harold saw Martin with Ellen was at the Saturday market. He had gone for tomatoes, real ones, the kind that tasted like summer and not plastic, and had been examining a basket when he heard Martin's voice. It was unmistakable, warm, easy, animated. Harold looked up to see Martin standing beside a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair, a wide straw hat, and a loose white blouse that made her look as though she floated rather than walked. She was laughing at something Martin said. Harold froze, then turned back to the tomatoes, suddenly unsure what ripe looked like. He didn't approach them. Didn't say hello. He waited until they'd wandered off, and only then let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That evening, while trimming deadheads from the hydrangeas in his side yard, Harold thought about how easily Martin had touched her elbow, about the way she leaned toward him, as if they'd known each other for years. Tomas called it. "She's a painter," he'd said 2 days later over lunch at the cafe. "Rents that old studio barn over on Wildwood Lane. Ellen Mears. Widowed. Friendly. Pretty, in that offbeat way." They looked familiar, Harold said, trying to sound neutral. Tomas raised a brow. Does that bother you? Harold said nothing. You should be careful, Tomas added, softer now. It's a dangerous thing. Harold, wanting what may not want you back. But Harold already knew that. He had known it since the porch. Since the wine. Since the touch on his arm. He'd known it every day since. And still, he let himself look. Still, he waited for the sound of Martin's laugh across the wind. He wasn't in love, he told himself. Just foolish, just lonely. Chapter 4. Signals. It rained for 3 days straight. The kind of rain that made time feel slower, more intimate. Harold watched it ribbon down his windows while he sipped coffee, the silence in the house loud as waves. He didn't see Martin during the storm. The porch was empty, the lights inside the cottage warm but distant. Once, Harold caught the shadow of 2 figures crossing the kitchen, Martin and Ellen. Laughing at something only they could hear, he turned away quickly. That night, he opened a box in his attic. It hadn't been touched in years. Inside were old sketches from his architecture, firm, faded photographs, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. Claire's handwriting. He read one, then another. They weren't love letters. Claire had never been that kind, but they were full of history. Their shared shorthand, her quiet strength, her knowing point. One line stayed with him. You have a way of closing your heart without realizing it. Try not to. By the 4th day, the rain lifted, and with it, a strange kind of clarity. Harold walked to the lighthouse. He hadn't been back since Claire's memorial. The steps groaned under his weight as he climbed. At the top, he looked out across the water, the wind pushing against him as if urging him to stay grounded. From that vantage point, he saw the cottages below, the threadbare road, the shoreline curving into the horizon, and he saw Martin, alone. This time, sitting on his porch, looking up. Harold didn't wave, didn't shout, he just stood there. And for once, he let himself feel everything. Title: The Quiet Season. Chapter 5. The clearing autumn came early that year. By the end of September, the air had gone crisp, and the maples behind Harold's house were already gold at the edges. Tourists had thinned out, leaving the town quiet again. The silence suited Harold. Mostly, he saw less of Martin. Their morning waves had grown infrequent, replaced with nods or nothing at all. Martin was often with Ellen at the co-op, walking the bluff trails, sometimes painting beside her on the shore. The sight of them together was no longer surprising, but it still landed somewhere soft and sore inside Harold. He avoided the lighthouse, avoided the porch, avoided asking himself what any of it meant, until Martin knocked on his door. It was a Thursday afternoon. Chapter 6. After light, October settled into the town like an old quilt, familiar, a little frayed, comforting in its cool hush. Harold kept busy. He repainted the kitchen cupboards, took long walks through the woods behind the cemetery, went with Tomas to a jazz night at the library, and actually enjoyed himself. But Martin did not return. Harold knew the cottage was empty again. By the way, the mailbox filled up. By the porch light that never came on. By the silence that stretched across the gravel road at night like fog. He wrote a letter, but never sent it. He went to the lighthouse once more. This time not to escape, but to remember. He stood at the top and looked out, not for anyone, but at everything. The cold sea, the curve of the coast, the reddening trees along Wildwood Lane. It was enough. For now. Tomas came by one afternoon, with a book Harold had lent him, and said, with unusual gentleness, "You know, it still counts. Loving someone, even if it goes nowhere. Maybe especially then." Harold nodded. He had stopped trying to fold the feeling away. It lived in him now like the sound of waves in a shell. Distant, quiet, always there. He never heard from Martin. Not that winter. Not in spring. But one June morning, almost a year to the day since they first met, Harold received a postcard. No return address. Just a photo of the Taos Desert, wide and red and endless, and 5 words in blocky, familiar handwriting. Still thinking about it. Harold read it once. Then again, and smiled. Epilogue. 2 summers later, the lighthouse was opened for a community art show. Harold hadn't planned to go, but Tomas insisted, and Ellen, still in town, still painting, had 3 pieces in the show. It seemed wrong not to support her. They weren't close, not exactly, but time had sanded the edges off things. The lighthouse gallery was full of familiar voices and unfamiliar ones. Harold moved through it slowly, letting the art speak where people didn't need to. Near the top of the spiral stair, hung in a narrow alcove, was a small canvas. A single chair on a weathered porch, angled toward the ocean. It was signed simply M. Chase. Harold stood in front of it for a long time. When he turned, Martin was there. He looked older, tanned, still in that worn Red Sox cap. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Thought you might come, Martin said. I almost didn't, Harold admitted. Martin nodded. I've been thinking less lately. Doing more. Harold smiled. Good. They walked down the steps together, quiet, side by side. Outside, gulls wheeled above the sea and the sky stretched on, wide, blue, and open.